All right, we are live.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this Monday evening, May 24th. This is a special meeting of the City Planning Commission in their capacity as the steering committee for the zoning alignment project that the city is currently working on. So so as everyone knows, the comprehensive plan, which was passed a number of years ago, is leading to a zoning code update, which is what ZAP is. So ZAP stands for Zoning Alignment Project, and it is the city aligning its zoning code with the comprehensive plan. So tonight, the Zoning Alignment Project staff at City Hall will present to the steering committee here some ideas, get feedback, some thoughts, which will eventually lead to a draft code that will be released for, of course, additional public feedback. There is no public feedback at this meeting tonight. There is a follow-up meeting scheduled specially for that. It is June 28th. You can sign up to speak. You can also submit written comments, and that all happens on the Zoning Alignment Project's website, which is rochesterzap.com, rochesterzap.com. To anyone that has not used the website or played around on it, I encourage you to do so. There's a lot of resources on there that should be used, as well as the ability to sign up for the June 28th meeting, which would be a follow-up to this meeting. So with that being said, we'll get started. I'm going to turn it over to Doreen.
So, Matt, I'm going to add something to your introductory remarks in that we have sent the Planning Commission some discussion materials to help prompt discussion today and get to some of the issues that we're confronting here at City Hall with writing this code. And so we're really looking for their feedback. Because we want to have this as a conversational meeting and not have as a presentation, these materials were sent ahead of time. We're not going to put them on the screen. However, we did load them onto the website. So if you go to the website under documents and presentations, that tab, you will see discussion materials for this meeting tonight. And so you can follow along with those materials for those of you who are viewing the YouTube. And also just to reiterate what Matt said, that if something comes up in the discussion tonight and you have something you want to add to it or question you want to ask, you can do that. You don't have to wait till June 28th. You can do it right on the city's, the ZAP website by going to the contact, it's the contact tab. So, and you can just submit your questions or comments through that immediately, even tonight if you want to. So I just want to add that to Matt's comments. And so I think we will, the other thing we want to talk about is that there will be more public comment and public input and public involvement in the fall. And we don't know exactly when, we want to do it live. So we're hoping that we'll be able to do like live mapping sessions and have several public meetings on this in the fall when we actually have a draft code that we can share with everybody and draft maps that we can share with everybody. Because right now we're really just trying to figure out what we want the draft code to say, because a comprehensive plan and a code are different. And so to translate the plan into code does take a lot of effort. So that is happening right now. And that's why we're meeting with the Planning Commission to kind of get some more direction on some issues. We got some broad direction from Planning Commission at the pre-meetings of April and May to kind of to make sure we were working in the right, we're going in the right direction with respect to zoning for jobs and sustainability and housing diversity. So we've got those broad buy-in from the Planning Commission. Now we're going to drill a little deeper into some specifics within those goals. So with that, we can look at the, the first page that we sent over, and Arista. Do you want to do introductions, Matt?
Yeah, I was just thinking that actually. Yeah. So I'll start with myself. My name is Matt Simonis. I work in the zoning office at the city. Doreen?
Doreen Kirkmeyer, Manager of Planning.
Also on the zoning alignment project team here, we have Tom,
Hello, I'm Tom. I will also work in the zoning office.
we have Kevin,
Hi, I'm Kevin Kelly. I'm in the city planning office.
and Arista, who is here tonight. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Arista Struntis. I'm from Camiris, the consulting firm located in Chicago, brought on board to help out with this project.
We also have Anna,
Hi there, Anna Keller from the zoning office. I am staff to the City Planning Commission.
Johanna,
Hi, I'm Johanna Brennan with the City Law Department.
and we also have all of the planning commissioners here tonight. Let's actually go through and have each commissioner just introduce themselves.
And we got Tom Worth also.
Hello, everyone. Tom Worth from the Law Department, Counsel to the Planning Commission.
Okay, and I'll run through, I'll have each of the commissioners introduce themselves. I'll just do it in the order that they come up on my screen. I will start with the chair, Commissioner Watson.
Yes, Dave Watson, Chair.
Commissioner Flower,
Brad Flower, South District here.
Commissioner Marlin.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Eugenio Marlin, Northwest Vice Chair.
Commissioner Harding,
Kim Harding, East District.
Commissioner Pichardo,
Milton Pichardo, Northeast.
and Commissioner Williams.
Hi, Commissioner Williams, Southwest.
All right, very good. Thank you, everyone, for introducing. And Doreen, you wanted to start with the first slide, the outline?
Yeah, and we can zip to this pretty quickly because we got some pretty hefty issues to go through, but we do want to talk about the general layout, and Arista's going to share that with us. And kind of just briefly describe how the plan is going to be, how the code will be reorganized.
Okay. So this is the one screen share that'll take place because it's a lot of words. Hopefully everybody can see this. So essentially what we wanted to do is look at the kind of current code sections and look at how codes, that we've been working with around the country are reorganized so that they're user-friendly techniques we've learned over the many years we've worked writing zoning codes. And so this is the code outline as it stands right now as we've proposed. And we think this makes a lot of sense for people kind of coming into the code and trying to figure out where they need to go for things. So you see here, Article 1 is a standard. If you're familiar with your zoning code or any zoning code, there's always an Article 1. It's always the title and purpose. And that's essentially what this would be, much like the current code now. The zoning districts chapter that really introduces this whole next big section, kind of one of the hearts of the ordinance, which is the zoning districts, really listing them, how they relate to the map, following that up with a use table. So this would be in Article 3, you see here, one global use matrix. Rather than listing uses in districts or any kind of other organization, there would be one single place in this article that you would go to see use permissions. The next set of things, which is Article 4, residential, Article 5, mixed use and commercial, Article 6, downtown, the village center districts, the industrial districts, special purpose districts. We know there's the parks and there's the airport overlay, kind of not clear if there's going to be more of those. The planned development district, as well as the urban renewal districts. All of your district standards are going to be brought together in these chapters. So in the residential or the mixed use commercial, you'll see everything laid out for those districts, the BMU, the NMU, the FMU, and the RC, based on the categories you have in your current comprehensive plan. And then kind of the last one that ties in, we kind of started with the use matrix and we closed with use standards, which are for certain uses within that matrix. There would be standards that are needed to mitigate their impact on surrounding neighbors or kind of larger areas. So that's where all those would be found. The next set really goes through kind of the other stuff on a lot that's not the principal use, that may not be the principal structure on the lot. So you're looking at general development standards, things like your environmental performance things, permitted encroachments. There may be some issues with noise control within the general development standards. Following up with accessory structures and uses, which can go from everything from dumpsters to fences and walls to various accessory structures like solar panels and wind turbines. off-street parking, which would start to look at ways to kind of put all the parking requirements together in that chapter, Article 15, and then kind of closing out this general development section, Article 16, which would be signs, which would be the update of the signs chapter. And then finally, the ordinance closes out, as many do, with the kind of bulk of the administration. So you see review authorities, you see general application procedures, you see zoning approvals and applications, fees, what do you do in nonconformities, and how is this article enforced, kind of rounding out the bulk of your administration portion of this table of contents. And then finally going into definitions and measurement methodologies, really how you use the various terms that are found throughout the zoning code. Everything would be referenced here within Article 23. Happy to take any questions. I'll be honest, usually on this one in our presentations, we don't get a lot of questions on it.
Yeah.
So it's more about the content in each of these articles than the structure itself, but happy to answer any you may have.
Okay. All right, cool. So the next, all right, let me get back here. I got to get my own. I'm going to be looking sometimes away from the screen so
Just
that yeah.
Just as a reminder too, to anybody watching, the documents that we are using as points of reference and content are available at rochesterzap.com.
Yep, under the documents and presentations tab. So the next thing you're looking at is this use table. We've talked about it before. We've shown you examples of it. I think I want to talk to you from a practitioner standpoint with respect to how much easier I think it would be to be able to look at one chart and see when a use is permitted or specially permitted, and what the conditions of that use are fundamentally to the use being established. So I know that as a practitioner over the years, I can't tell how many times I've had to leaf through the code to see where something is first permitted, or where is it first specially permitted, and you're trying to get through all the if it's all embedded in their district regulations, you're kind of like going through all the district regulations to get to the use chart. And it seems to me from a perspective of using the code, it would be a lot easier to have everything in one chart, so it's very easy to see where something is prohibited, where it's permitted, where it's specially permitted, where it's first permitted, where it's first specially permitted. But the other thing that I think is really important with respect to the change in the way we're handling this is the final column, or one of the columns in the final, over on the right side of it, is the existing non-residential buildings in residential districts. We've included that as a column on the table. And the reason we did that is because we want to see how we can allow more uses to reoccupy in an easier way these buildings that were built as something that's non-residential. So we're going to have a slide to talk more about that, because we've got some interesting questions we want to talk to you with respect to that specifically, but we're handling it almost as its own district. And that's why it's treated the way it is on the use table. And so you can see what things are going to be allowed there. Obviously, we're not going to allow industrial uses in these unless it's a pre-existing industrial building in a resident, which we have. But if it's a pre-existing, what we more often see is a pre-existing mixed-use building, and what can you do with the first floor in that if it's not really lending itself to residential? Well, we want to see some commercial uses being able to go in there, and people like to have services, and they like to have retail close by, and so in some respects it's kind of a nice thing for a neighborhood, but it can bring impacts that we want to make sure that we deal with. So but in the meantime, I just want to point out that's kind of a new thing. This is not a reformatted thing. This is kind of a new thing for us. So other than that, I don't know if the team has anything they want to add about the benefits or the changes that are brought about by the use of a use table rather than embedded in the district regs.
I think it'll just be a lot clearer for both the community and the public. The table is going to be really easy to understand, and you don't have to read, in all the individual zoning district regulations to figure out what's allowed where.
Yeah, these are typically the ones that come to Planning Commission for like reactivation because they're in a residential district, but they were built as some sort of a mixed use or non-residential floor area. So as Tom said, hopefully the intent would be to provide ease of both application as a practitioner as well as clarity for applicants.
I think one thing to emphasize anytime we roll out this table is that while it is simplified and easier to use, it's not a standalone table. And for many uses in different districts, there are additional requirements that we're putting in place that would be in the text part of the code. So if you see that a given use is allowed in a particular district, that's not the end of the conversation. We'll still have to just look up and say, okay, it's allowed, but here's a couple of conditions that it has to meet in that particular instance. So it's got to go hand in hand with the code.
Good point. And right now, if you go into the code, you'll see that you're in a particular district, and you see a list, the whole list of permitted uses, and a whole list of specially permitted uses. And oftentimes you see it repeated at the end of the uses listed, and then it says to refer to the requirements for additional requirements for specified uses is what we call it in 2003. So that is happening now in the code, and in this way we're doing it. The final column says use standards, so it'll be right next to the use standards, and on from an online standpoint, you can just click on those use standards and it'll take you to them. But Kevin makes a really good point that just because something is permitted or specially permitted, it doesn't mean you can't look at, you don't have to look at what else the code may be requiring of that use.
Can you reflect a little bit on, so as we're looking at the table, and I like conceptually the use of a table, I do think it makes it a lot easier instead of having to flip through every single space and say, what can we do? What can we not do? Having a cheat sheet, so to speak, is a wonderful thing. Two questions here. If there's a lot of language in what we receive talking about kind of getting rid of each individual use case and just saying we're going to call all commercial uses this thing, how does that interplay with this table that does actually break out all of those different uses? That's question one. Question two, I'm sure these tables have been used somewhere else, and what types of feedback? I'm more interested in the negative, just to, I don't know what hurdles I don't know about yet. So what types of negative things or negative feedback have other places that have used these tables gotten already?
Okay, so Arista, I'm going to have you take that second question, but I'm going to try and answer the first question. So, when we first started out with doing this process of all uses indoors and then indoor, I guess. And it's kind of this start to move towards a more form-based code versus a use-based code, and so we were like, let's just do all uses indoors and let's see where it goes. Well, there's a lot of uses out there that don't fit into all uses indoors. So like what we had to start doing is pulling out those things that have unique impacts and or don't have the full operation indoors naturally. So we had to pull those out. So basically it's all uses indoors unless listed below. And then we have a lot of things listed below. We have all of our vehicle related uses listed below, anything with outdoor components listed below. There's a lot of things you're going to see, so you can see we pulled some things out. You're seeing them on the material we sent you for an example. We were trying to put hotel into all uses list, all uses indoors, and then we had to pull that out for different reasons. So you'll see that there are a lot of listed things, but anything that's not listed is going to be all uses indoors. So it takes in your office, it takes in retail, and there's some other things that are indoors that I think we had one like animal care is as long as it's all indoors. If it has an outdoor component, then it's animal care outdoors. But you know, there's some nuanced things that are related to being completely indoors that will be listed and are included in that.
Yeah, and more will likely come up too as you talk about uses and then the associated impacts with them. What ends up becoming of that is, well, all uses indoors with the exception of a list that'll have stuff added to it.
Got it. So it sounds to me like it's it's trying to simplify it as much as humanly possible.
Exactly.
But it'll always be. Okay, got it.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, and I think Kevin's even asked these questions like, how is it form-based if we have all these things listed out? Well, it's not form-based. And really, like a lot of regulations that we've looked at that are, you know, they say they're form-based code, but if you go into that form-based code, they still do specify uses in a lot of ways.
Right.
So yeah, I think we wanted to, like you said, take it as far as we could, but we need to make sure we're protecting the community. So Arista, did you want to speak to this being used in other cities and what's the feedback you're getting?
Sure. I would say pretty much every ordinance we've written in the past, 10, 15 years has gone to a global use matrix. Have not heard any negative effects about it. It really is just a simpler way to deal with uses. You can either look at your use and look across the table and see, oh, I want to open an animal care facility. Where can I do it? Or I look at, the FMU, I have a property here. What can I do with my property? So you've got kind of the two ways into the use table that everybody prefers. The fights you see are kind of, to Terrain's point, how do we specifically control certain uses in certain districts and all that? That's where all the fighting goes on. But as a general format, it's universally accepted as much easier. Everybody likes to take about 40 pages out of a zoning ordinance and stick it in a 3-page table. So.
Any other questions on that? Okay, so I'm gonna move this screen for myself here so I'm not staring off in the distance. Okay, so moving on to the next slide in our discussion materials okay, this is a pretty minor thing, but we did want to bring it to you because it could have an impact on your workload. So we want to kind of talk to you about that. I don't know, Matt, if you want to talk, or do you want me to just continue, or do you want to talk?
I can talk a little bit about this. Yeah, to Doreen's point, a little bit potentially on planning commission workload, but from an applicant standpoint and a being reasonable standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense, or we think it makes a lot of sense. So thoughts on proposed process changes. So currently, if you're a specially permitted use, which is a use that's, of course, thought to be permissible, but has some sort of unique impact, the Planning Commission can waive any of those standards that are not met that go along with it. The problem is that uses that are permitted as of right but don't meet those, an area variance is required to waive those standards. So an area variance means, of course, that you're not meeting the code. So the threshold is much higher. It's much more difficult to seek a variance than it is a special permit, just the way the code is written. So the thought was, if the use is permitted as of right, potentially the City Planning Commission should have the authority to waive those things as opposed to the zoning board. Because if the use itself is as of right, we don't want the threshold to be so much more than a use that's specially permitted. Does anyone have any questions on that? I hope that made some sense.
I think the other
there. So if a use is permitted as of right and someone wants an area variance, who decides? Or
no, what we're saying is that what would happen is if it's an as of right use, and when you click on that last column and you go to the use standards and they don't meet the use standards, instead of going to an area variance, it kicks in a special permit. So it becomes a specially permitted use, and therefore the Planning Commission can decide whether that's a waivable standard. And one of the benefits of that, having one board always looking at these standards, is that there's consistent handling across the city. So you can start to see patterns, and you guys can, you've had conversations with respect to some of those standards with maybe a similar use, and you can start applying a consistent approach to how you're waiving standards. Instead of some people going to the zoning board and some people going to the planning commission, you could be handling the same standard differently. So that was one of the benefits. Did that answer your question, Tom?
Yes, thanks.
Any other questions on that or thoughts?
So you're gonna be working a little harder.
So, well, Matt, now I do have a question, because so if it's like a numerical standard or a distance standard, then would the ZBA still decide, but it's just
No,
use standards would be things like whether, like in a rooming house, you have someone supervising, or
It's
Yeah,
just the additional requirements.
Yep, that's right. So it's just the additional requirements, Tom, that's under, if it's anything else with respect to the use, it would be an area variance.
okay, so like additional requirements that are in like the parts of our code now that are
That are numerical, which there are, yes, it would be waived by the planning commission.
okay.
Okay, so back to the concept of all indoor commercial uses. We've got a lot of words on this particular discussion material. It just gives you some ideas of why we're doing it. And I think I told you this before. I remember when hookah lounges came in and we were trying to figure out what the heck it is. And, you have to liken it to something, but instead it's an all commercial uses indoors. We pulled out things that don't fall neatly into a category of all commercial uses like we discussed earlier. So, one of the things that I kind of want to talk about is this idea combining two things we've talked about. One is all commercial uses indoors, and Matt, jump in here when you want, but combined with this idea of giving more uses and more flexibility to built as non-residential buildings in residential districts. You start to see when those two things converge. So you're talking about all commercial uses indoors in a building, if you're kind of leaning towards allowing that in buildings that are commercial buildings in residential districts, we've got to figure out how to identify what those impacts could be and how to mitigate those impacts. So when it comes to something like, let's just bring this up, retail is generally a low impact use. So you're thinking, oh, well, that's an all commercial uses indoors. And we would, open that up for these buildings in residential districts that are built for commercial use. So then, of course, what do we think about but convenience stores? And, we hear from our community partners that convenience stores can cause problems to a neighborhood. So in looking at that, we just wanted the Planning Commission to kind of talk this out with us with respect to those buildings that are non-conforming. Any thoughts on convenience stores or other uses that you think that if they were to be reoccupied in some of these pre-existing buildings might be a problem, and how we might mitigate the impacts?
This would be to Doreen's point, this would be the things that as the Planning Commission, you hear about these reactivations of spaces, what some of those issues are, and are there ways within the code to mitigate them while allowing the uses to go in, what they may be, and what that conversation looks like as a potential code option.
I'm a big advocate for reusing non-conforming structures as they were intended to be used initially. So like, commercial structures, and I've got some personal experiences with this, having a commercial structure that we've converted into a residential facility, but that was a minority of the time, right? That doesn't happen very often. So I like using it. You see a nice a nice corner store with perhaps mixed use, some residential above, something like that. Anyway, I really like it being used. I keep coming back to, and I don't know what the process looks like, but the idea of engaging that community, I don't know how the parameters are set. I don't know how to do that, but directly to the people that will be impacted, figure out some sort of protocol where their buy-in is a part of it. I don't know. And the limitations being something as simple as hours of operation. So maybe all uses are allowed, but hours of operation are the biggest issue for that community or for that neighborhood, that if it wasn't a 24/7 convenience store, that some of that late night stuff would no longer be a concern, and how to get that feedback and what does that procedure look like?
Yeah, hours of operation are really the key for something like that usually. And I, unfortunately, for a bar or for a convenience store that sells alcohol, and Johanna can speak a little to this, but we have the issue around the liquor authority having authority over our authority. So how much can we actually control hours of operation? And are there other ways we should be managing this? Johanna, you got any comments on that? Like what we've learned over the years?
Yeah, well, and we talked about this earlier, that the state liquor authority issues liquor licenses and they preempt our authority to say then when an establishment that has a liquor license, when they have to close. So, there are some things we can do, but there is a limitation on a bar that is allowed, that's been issued a liquor license and is allowed to stay open until 2:00. We can't, through our zoning code, say, nope, you have to close at 9 or 11. So that's just something that we need to consider. There's some things we can do, possibly working with the state liquor authority to inform them about concerns that we might have about certain locations, and encourage them to limit the liquor license hours.
Thank you. So there is legal precedent then that the SLA overrules. And so if an operator says, I know you're trying to limit me, but my license says this, they would actually win out and go to those hours.
Yeah. The only exception is with outdoor usage.
Outdoor.
I don't know whether, I think it's just like SLA's discretion, but they choose to abide by the outdoor hours or that a city land use board or city code provides. But yeah, otherwise.
And I don't mean to call out a particular, I'm just thinking of an example, right? Like anecdotal evidence. Half Pint on the corner of Oxford and Park shuts at 11. Why? How? Like, how does that work? Is that just because they're
that's their choice?
Oh.
Yeah.
The owner obviously can choose to close earlier than the license permits.
I'll tell you as a community member, it was like the story, and this is why it's anecdotal. The story going around is that they only got it there because they were told they had to close at 11 because the neighborhood.
Originally, that's true.
That is true. That's actually true. And then
there was a lawsuit.
Yeah. Right. And so do they still close at 11? No.
Not one of my haunts. I don't know, but I just remember the story.
Yeah. No, that story is true.
One of the things that we're trying to fix in the current code is that a lot of these properties, they're so hard to reuse. So then we end up with vacant properties, or we have people who've invested in a property and then they can't get a return out of it. They can't get businesses in there. They can't really even they can barely get an answer from us what is allowed without going through a process. So it's really hard for them to market those properties as well. So we're hoping to try and avoid that issue.
I guess the concern that I have is similar to what Brad had, is that I think historically CPC has kind of been the buffer between the community and the applicants when they're looking to reuse property that's in a residential district specifically, when we don't have as much control over hours of operation, if they're having liquor or convenience stores with the noise, the nuisance, the hours, those kinds of things. So that if there's a way that, we can, I think as Brad was asking, getting some community input for those special cases where the building exists historically to make sure that the use in the current times is more appropriate for those who are in the neighborhood.
And also what happens at those meetings, to that point, is things like refuse storage and debris, where that's gonna, happen. A lot of these sites are on these small parcels, and those considerations need to happen. So we would either need to address that in the code somehow, or where it's currently happening at the Planning Commission.
And even parking is an issue. Where these people are going to park, how long are they going to be staying? How's that going to impact the residential neighborhood when you have now a business within that neighborhood?
So I wonder if we could, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but I wonder if there's a way to allow as of right uses to maybe a certain hour. I don't know if you can pick out, like, specifically say a convenience store. That was one thing we really had a hard time with in the past, is like, we had to say it's sold, two of the three of beer, lottery, and tobacco or something. Anyway, if there's a way to say as of right, uses can go in these buildings to a certain hour. If you want to go past that hour to operate, then it requires a special permit. So we could do something like that. So it's kind of like a compromise that we're still giving, for uses that are going to abide by a certain sort of limitation on impacts, they can go in as of right. But if your use inherently cannot abide by those limitations, then it would shift to a special permit, and a special permit has a public process, so the community could weigh in at that point. So we would have to figure out what those thresholds are. So do you have any gut reactions or something you can all agree on that you think would be reasonable thresholds that we would establish for something like that? Like, what's the right hour of operation? Are there any other thresholds?
Yeah, I think some of that has to, at least for me, it's building specific. You may have some buildings in a residential area that are on a main corridor or a thoroughfare where there's constant traffic already, and it doesn't impact potentially that corridor negatively. If that is on a non-arterial, it's really in the heart of a residential, that's going to be a lot different. So where do we make the distinction in approving or not approving that specific use?
So what you're saying is it's not an operational threshold always. Sometimes
Right.
it's a locational threshold.
Absolutely.
Okay. We have this comprehensive access and mobility plan, the CAMP, that has classifications of streets and and we've described them, we've incorporated them into the zoning code. And so we can use those classifications to do those locational thresholds, because we've already got them established in the code. So yeah, that's something we could do.
Something to look into.
Anything else besides hours that you think would be a concern to reoccupying buildings that are within a neighborhood, within a residential neighborhood? I know you said parking.
Potentially, but again, I think the other issue goes with the use, refuse, noise, those kinds of things that historically neighbors and the community have concerns about.
So maybe loading and unloading, garbage pickup.
Deliveries.
Delivery. Yeah. Okay.
Intensity of traffic, I think, is just a big one, but that's so hard. It's subjective based on business model, and then it's also subjective based on how successful they are at what they're proposing. So it's hard, but I know it's like a lot of things like, oh, they're going to be 50, it's going to be nonstop, and it's going to be a conveyor belt of people. And that might be a concern with intensity of use in terms of how many people.
So maybe like an occupancy. Okay, that's helpful.
I mean, one thing I've seen that's in our existing code is size. What is it for mixed use? like, is it retail or commercial, or is it a 6,000 square foot or 2,000 square foot limit?
Yeah,
You could have residential on the upper floors.
yep. Yeah, well, but those limitations apply to commercial uses in a commercial district. So we don't usually we'd have to add that kind of square footage limitation as a threshold for the standards for reoccupying these buildings.
Yeah, I guess that's more an idea for the all uses indoors.
Yep,
in other
that's
realms,
right.
like in
And
other zoning districts other than non-residential buildings and residential zones.
Yep. And so we can talk about that when we get to that topic, but I think that's a really good point that we are going to be relying on the district regulations to limit the scale of these all commercial uses indoors. Okay. Okay. So actually, that's what we are, indoor. Okay, so yeah, so actually, Tom, we've covered that. So I've added that note, but for that idea of lumping all these uses into one thing, they're not regulated necessarily by the specific operational, the operational characteristics, but they're regulated based on their scale. And the scale is regulated with the district regulations, and that's something that Arista and Camaros is helping us with some of those design and performance-based requirements and standards. So, hotel is up next. And the reason that we want to talk about this is because we're changing the definition. The hotels, there's still these, traditional hotel models, but hotels are changing. There's a whole emerging trend in how people stay in hotels. There's some hotels now that don't have registration desks, and it's all handled online. And then we have more and more people are using these short-term rental options as a hotel, because they're not renting a room in a hotel, they're renting a house to, and we all, I don't know about you guys, but I know we're doing some of that when we travel now. We don't just look at hotels now, we look at the whole vacation rental market and what's being offered. So we've changed the definition, and we're showing it on your materials, what the current definition is and what the proposed definition is. And we're broadening the definition, and I think Arista, you might have helped us a little bit with that, but we're broadening the definition of hotel to include things that are not fitting into that standard model, but also if you own a property and it is not owner occupied, and it is fully on the internet for renting for short-term vacation rentals, or for bachelorette parties or bachelor parties or whatever, it is what we're suggesting that no longer, even though it may be in a house, it is no longer a residential use. It's a full-on commercial use. And so we want to put limitations on those in residential districts. So we pulled hotel out of the all commercial uses indoors, and we're dealing with it in that regard. So, anyway, I'm putting it out there. I don't know if the rest of my team wants to add anything on that. About the
I guess
hotel.
one thing to mention there is that, there's a difference between how you would casually use the word hotel in conversation and how we're specifically defining it here for the zoning code. And we're broadening it in a way that is not consistent with how people casually use the word, but we're doing it in a way that is intentional for the sake of the code and for our objectives or our suggestions around how to manage those types of properties where it's not owner occupied and it's fully intended to be, an Airbnb, vacation rental, that sort of thing. Whereas if it is owner occupied, and Doreen, maybe you could speak to that, that would be dealt with in another manner, sort of outside of the zoning code.
The other thing to consider here too, if going through these two definitions, you all think of a situation that doesn't fit into one of these definitions, or maybe it does and it's unintentionally fitting into one of those definitions. So either way, also please let us know. So what what we did is tried to come up with scenarios and what that would look like based on reading of these definitions. So if you think of something like that or see it, that's also a good conversation point that allows us to make any necessary changes.
I have
Oh, go ahead.
I have a question for Arista, with your experience from other municipalities, and maybe some have tried an approach like this, or maybe not, but if you have any information from other municipalities about how difficult or easy it is to ascertain how long a period of rental there is, or ascertain whether a property is really owner occupied or not?
Unfortunately, the news that I will share with you is every community is struggling with this, in particular because of the boom of Airbnbs. And so we've seen approaches to it that are kind of all over the place. There are some that look at hotels as hotels in the ordinance are a traditional hotel. Airbnb or short-term vacation rental is separate. They don't even deal with it in zoning. They make a license for it and deal with that way outside of the zoning code. Others integrated into the zoning code do make those connections between owner occupied, non-owner occupied. But again, it's an enforcement issue. It's kind of the idea of how are you going to go and make sure the owner's there. But places are making that distinction. So no one has come up with the solution yet. I'll say that we have to work within each community that we're contracted to kind of determine what situations do we need to be handled. Is the issue more that these Airbnbs are turning into party houses, or do people not really care? So it's got to be refined specifically to each community. So we can bring our knowledge of this and things we've seen happen, but we don't have a blanket solution that works for everybody.
Question is the focus on this to really, I do think it's a good idea to be strategic about Airbnb type uses, considering climate impacts in Rochester and there are lots of things that make me bullish on an Airbnb type of model doing well in this city, which has a whole boatload of downstream implications, especially for current land ownership in the city. You look at places like New Orleans, you look at places that people have been priced out entirely because of all of these little pop-up Airbnb things. If that's the intention for this, is it helpful at all to come right out and kind of name it a little bit? The definition to me, I think you can read between the lines and be like, okay, this sounds like Airbnb to me, but I don't know if it's is there a way to make it more concrete, to make it clear that that's what the intention is? Or maybe I'm missing the intention entirely.
No, that is part of the intention. And we did hear from the community during the comprehensive plan process. People were concerned about these kind of uses popping up in their neighborhoods. So we're trying to address that. And we did at one point have the term, rent, short dwelling, comma, short-term rental. And then we started talking about hotel, and then it just kind of, as we work through it, we realized that, they really do kind of serve as a hotel. So why don't we just include it in the hotel and put it out there and see how it, how does it fly with everybody that, and I'll tell you that I understand that it's harder for you to kind of look at this without seeing where it would be allowed. So I'm going to look and see what we're thinking right now. So
as you're looking, Doreen, a question comes to mind. And I don't mean to play devil's advocate on this, but ever searching for how to monetize things. would I be exempt from this if I get a rental property, put somebody that I know there is a long-term tenant who happens to be an in-person concierge for the business, but then all 4 other bedrooms are Airbnb? Am I thereby exempt from this because I have one long-term renter?
Okay, so you're talking about not, are you talking about a single family home? Or you're talking?
Yeah, sure. Call it single family home. Yeah.
Single family home. So, and it's a 5-bedroom home, and the renter lives in one, and has 1 bedroom, and they rent out to 4 other, that would be a boarding house. That would,
even on a short-term basis, it would still be a boarding house.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, Doreen, I have a question regarding the less than 30 days. Was there a consideration for that, or what was the consideration for that versus longer time? Let's say you have snowbirds coming in from who knows where, Texas. They want to come to Rochester. They want to stay for 6 months.
Yeah.
And they find a place. How does this fit in with the definition? Or would it fit in with the definition?
I feel like I think we were thinking that anything 30 days and over would be a tenant, like it would just become a rental property. That's what we were thinking, yes.
Okay.
I think that also vibes with tenant landlord law.
Okay.
Can
I
can I just like nitpick, and maybe this will get picked up in the drafting, but should it be 30 consecutive days and or 30 days at one time or something like that? I also thought about, what if, I guess I'm not as familiar with landlord tenant law, but is there like a number of days per year that it would, on one, either on the owner occupied or otherwise, that might capture this a little bit? It took me a couple of read throughs to kind of get both owner occupied and non-owner occupied definitions. And I'm just wondering, I can't figure out where the gaps are, but I feel like every time I was like, oh, this is missing something. And I think part of it is consecutive. Part of it is maybe how many days per year it gets rented out. And even in the non-owner occupied sentence, sorry, I've got 2 screens, so it's
okay.
But I think there needs to be added time there as well.
No, I think those comments are helpful. Well, all the comments are helpful, but that's helpful too in terms of drafting language. And then to Brad's point earlier about potentially being more explicit other than just short-term rental.
I think too, especially for the audience who will be interested in the Airbnb, we want it to be as simple as possible.
Very clear.
It won't be some developers, New York City attorney or something.
So those are very helpful. And just for your own information, what we're thinking right now is a hotel would not be a permitted use in the low density residential, the medium density residential, or the high density residential. And for the boutique, neighborhood, and flexible mixed use districts, it would be it would be allowed by special permit. So it's not like they're being, we're allowing this proliferation of these things throughout the city. So that's kind of what we're thinking. Like downtown, it would be allowed, obviously allowed as of right. And I'm going to get the, let's see, and in the regional commercial areas where we would think we'd see hotels popping up. So it is pretty restrictive. And of course, just want to reiterate that this would not be, someone who wants to rent out to somebody for the week or 2 that the the Masters is in town or whatever, some big golfing event, and people leave their houses and let people stay in them. That would not be included in this definition. Those people are, people can still do that with their houses and not trigger any zoning review at all.
So I think with respect to the districts and where it would be permitted as Doreen just outlined, I think if you sort of flip that and want to know, well, where can I do an Airbnb? You can in a residential district if it's an owner occupied situation, right? But if it's not an owner occupied situation, that, you know, somebody owns a house and they're just renting it out for less than 30 days at a time, then that would not be permitted in any of the residential districts. Does that help?
Yeah, because there's a presumption that if the owner is present on the property, you know, they're not going to let anyone, you know, destroy the property or destroy their rest, or, you know, or infringe on their neighbors that they got to live next to every day.
So that would apply to a multifamily dwelling too, as long as owners occupying one of the units, they'd be exempt.
No, it would have to be an owner occupied dwelling unit. So it could be a condo. It could be a condo owner in a multifamily.
And it also, I mean, I guess, Kevin, I think your point was helpful, at least to me, because it's basically saying I own the home, and if I go away for vacation and rent out my house while I'm gone, I'm still owner occupied. So it's
That's right.
So that was helpful, because I was like, what? This kind of that's kind of mean. But thank you for that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be owner occupied at the moment. And I guess it's important too to say that, you know, the strategy that we're trying to design here, we're not at all saying that this is going to completely remove all nuisance problems. We're just trying to reduce them as much as possible while still giving folks the economic opportunity to do this sort of thing. So, well, like with almost every decision we're making here, it's all about striking balances. And sometimes where we strike first, we're off a little bit, and we'll take your feedback to refine that. And same goes for the community feedback that we get. But so much of this is just about striking those balances.
All right, thank you for that. All right, so moving on to boarding houses. So one fundamental change is that we are changing the definition. We're not calling it a rooming house, we're calling it a boarding house. And there's a really simple reason for that. This code is trying to align itself with lots of different things, okay? We're trying to align with the Rochester 2034 plan. We're also trying to align with the New York State Building Code. And if you've ever worked on the counter with people in the zoning office, which some of us have, or if you've ever visited the permit counter as an applicant, you know, you hear a set of rules with the zoning code, and then you adjust to that and you get an approval or whatever, and then you got to go to the building code, and it's a whole new set of rules and whole new set of vocabulary and definitions. And so we're trying to the greatest extent that we can, because there are two codes that have two different intents. So you can't completely combine and unify. But to the extent that we can align, we are trying to do that. So the building code calls it a boarding house. The zoning's always called it a rooming house. So in just to try to make it easier for people, we're moving towards the New York State Building Code boarding house, and we're using the boarding house definition as well. So that's the change. We're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. It's really all about making that alignment. And we're pulling out some of the definition of rooming house, and we're putting it into a standard of the code, so that there may be opportunity for waiving that or not. And if anyone needs it waived, it goes to the Planning Commission, which would trigger a public review. So that you know, really doesn't change a lot, because we're not doing anything different. I think the thresholds are the same. Even they're just moving to a standard rather than a definition. So just wanted to get kind of your feedback on that. I had another note to myself about that. So one of the things we're doing that is a big change for the community is that we're expanding where they can go, but they're specially permitted everywhere. So nowhere by right at all. And if they are going, if someone wants to establish one in the LDR, the low density residential, or the MDR, the medium density residential, it has to be owner occupied. So that goes to what I think was it you, David, that was talking about the owner occupancy. Oh no, I can't remember. Somebody asked me about the boarding house. But anyway, so it would have to be owner occupancy. And the reason that this is the case is because there are people living in large homes that are having a very hard time maintaining those large homes, that they own them, they live in them. They're hard to maintain because they're large. So, you know, they could let it go into, you know, into complete, what's dilapidated, or, you know, we could give them other options. And so one of the things we'd like to open up the option for is this idea of them taking on roomers. And it's possible, right now they're allowed to take up to 2 roomers. But we want to expand that opportunity to let them make any bedroom that they have in the house a potential boarding, a sleeping unit is called now in what we're proposing. So this is really about, you know, wealth building. It's also about increasing housing options. So these rooming units in an owner occupied rooming house. So you've got someone living there who has some stake in that property. So these could be really nice units. This is a nice opportunity for people to have a low cost bedroom that they can stay in a boarding house. So that's kind of the idea here. And that's why we added the owner occupancy requirement for the LDR and MDR for obvious reasons to lower the impacts that could be caused by these. So anybody from the ZAP team want to add anything to that?
I'm interested to hear what Planning Commission, what their thoughts are around what Doreen said, if using the zoning code for such a thing is something that's, you know, what your thoughts are around that.
In my opinion, I think a lot of these changes and decisions that we're making today, I think they are beneficial. I think that, as all of you guys mentioned, I think it's going to be increasing the opportunity for investment into the community. So I don't have anything negative to say, although we may have to really explore the demarcation within the city, where we're going to be allowing some of these things happening, taking in consideration that we are growing fast. Downtown is really growing. So where we're going to end, and how can we make sure that certain people take advantage of this opportunity and create wealth, not just for a certain sector, but really throughout at least try throughout the entire population. But I think it's a good effort, everything I've heard.
Doreen, any consideration on, I'm taking this one step further, and I'm actually on the E-code right now searching. I don't see anything listed for hostel usage.
Say it again.
Hostels. So if you, instead of like the rooming in the boarding house seems to have a very specific 1 person per living space, or 1 person per sleeping unit, whatever.
1 or 2. It can go up to 2 people per sleeping unit.
Got it. And what about hostels where you create 6 bunks? I'm like, if we become a hotspot, and like if music and Jazz Fest comes back in this great way, like I would love to have this problem, right? I think it would be awesome. Yeah. But is it something we should be considering now?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I traveled around Europe staying in hostels, so I totally get what you're talking about. And I don't know, team, if we've talked about this at all. No.
That's why we're here tonight.
Yeah.
I will say the usual starting point in other cities is that hostels are just considered hotels. You know, it's a different living space arrangement, but the traffic of people coming and going, that impact stays the same.
The impacts are the same.
So maybe what we'll do is in the definition of hotel, let's just make sure that we don't leave out the opportunity for the hostel to be a hotel. And then let's make sure that maybe we can clarify it saying this includes short-term vacation rentals and hostels, and see, make sure it's clear in the code that that's included.
Yeah,
I mean, because, sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Kevin, I was just saying, I think the inclusion of it, like the overt inclusion of it, is pretty useful. Only in the sense of like business development. If there's a space, if there's the ability to bring young, not even young, but just people who are like very budget minded to a city that is already budget minded, I think it's a kind of a win-win. So like giving people the ability, like giving them a layup versus something they need to think a lot about is nice.
Yeah, that's a good point. We hadn't thought about that, so I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, because right now hotels defined, it wouldn't include hostels, right? Because it's like single rooming units that have their own bathrooms, or just even having single rooming units. Like it wouldn't cover like where you have bunks and
Right, we mentioned private bathrooms in the current definition, but I don't think it's in the proposed one.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Tom, are you looking at the proposed definition?
Yep.
I mean, Tom Ward.
yeah, no, I am. Yeah, so that it got rid of the rooming units.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. So actually, our new definition does lend itself better to the hostels.
Yeah.
So let's
Just going
talk
back to Arista, to your point that each city kind of creates their own approach and that we have a unique custom approach to defining hotels. Do you and other commissioners can chime in as well, think that it makes sense for us to make sure that hostel gets wrapped into our custom definition of hotel? Or is there any reason to treat them differently than our sort of broad definition that we came up with?
I don't know enough of the operating model to know whether that would jack up the operating model to like try, you know what I mean? Like it's almost like, yeah, I don't have enough info.
Yeah, I think you're okay right now. I mean, obviously it's something to keep reevaluating as you're going. I don't see a reason to pull them out separately, in particular because it's very clear that they are, I mean, they have the similar impacts to hotels. Some of these hostels can be very large. So, and I'm not against them. I just think, we can look, and if for some reason, somehow we think it belongs somewhere, we can just take another look at it.
Yeah. So again, that would be, the scale would be limited by the district regulations for the size, building height and building size, but that could be a big hostel for like if I'm thinking in the NMU or the FMU. So, so going to the standards for boarding house, I wouldn't mind just going, even though they haven't changed, I wouldn't mind you guys just taking a look at those standards and seeing if you think they're sufficient, because there is a lot of concern in the community about properties turning into boarding houses, and specifically like fraternity or a sorority could be, causes problems in communities. So yeah, so this would be, so I just want you to think about that while you're looking at these standards and let us know what you think about them.
I want to provide space for everyone. So I'm like trying to hold back, but yeah, I love the idea of having somebody that's like there.
Okay.
I think so many of these businesses are successful if they have a little bit more like hands-on approach. And I'm a big customer service advocate though. So, it's a more intensive model to run, but it tends to make the community happier because there's less riffraff.
And I agree with Brad that I think it makes a lot of sense, the standards that you have proposed. And especially I think that it reinforces, I think, our concern that we hear from residents and neighbors about who the security, who's going to maintain, monitor, provide that assurance that people are appropriately being housed and monitored, so that eliminates some of the oversight that we're asked to do or to provide.
Okay, great. And also, we included on the materials just how it used to be called a rooming unit in the old code, and the new proposed code, we would go to sleeping unit, which is aligned with the building code. And basically, just want to point out that a sleeping unit can have a kitchen or a bathroom, but not both. So it's not a dwelling unit, it's a sleeping unit. Okay, so moving on to parking. Again, this is a hot topic for the community is parking. And as you know, we've gotten probably as much input from the community about eliminating parking minimums as we've gotten from the community about concern about eliminating parking minimums. So this is a kind of again, like what Kevin was saying, this is a balancing act. So we're trying to figure out where the balance is, and we don't want people to be impacted negatively, but we also don't want to be in this business of trying to figure out what their business model is and how people are getting there. And we need to make sure they have tons and tons of surface parking lot. So, so parking minimums would no longer be the primary regulatory tool like we have now. And so we put some thresholds in above which we think there could be impacts that need to be mitigated. So therefore they need to be reviewed through a parking transportation access plan. So it's basically because you commissioners already know we have a parking demand analysis and an alternative parking plan. This is a combination of those two things. And so these are the thresholds that we came up with. So places of assembly, which is a building code term, and building code does occupancy postings for places of assembly. So that takes in your bars, restaurants, theaters, and stuff like that. So where people assemble. And we thought that the occupancy posting of 75, of more than 75 people would require one of these plans. So let's just give you some examples of different restaurants around town, because it's what we did when we were like, what should that threshold be? We started looking up occupancy postings for different restaurants. So like Giants, the occupancy posting is 143 people. So it would be half, the posting would be half of what Giants is occupancy posting is. So that property Giants would obviously have to go through this review. The Hideaway, which is a little smaller, is 101 persons occupancy posting. The Winfield is 150 persons. The Asian restaurant on Witten Road called Kong Tai, is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
That has an occupancy posting of 26 persons. So something like that would not be required to get to go through the process.
And that particular restaurant Doreen just mentioned was required to go to the zoning board for an area variance. So that's a good example of, from the perspective of size, which is what we're trying to kind of disclose here to people about what an occupancy of 75 people looks like relative to the size of a restaurant. The Kong Thai restaurant, which is approximately 1,100 square feet, I believe, with their occupancy posting. They wouldn't be required to provide parking, but they're there because the zoning board granted a variance for the parking that they did not have.
So do we want to make a restaurant like that scale, go through an area variance for parking? It's just
knee jerk for me says 75 based on the figures that you gave for the first two places. Giants, I didn't realize Giants had such a high, I guess it's a pretty simple place. Hideaway too, I know they've got a tiny parking lot in the back. Do you have an idea off the top of your head what, like, per people you need translates to how many parking spaces they need to like come up with? And like, if we're doing the alternative parking plan idea where it's like, okay, 5 to transit, 3 to bikes, 2 to parking, like what's the ratio there based on restaurants, let's say?
So I don't think we're going to put in any kind of requirement at all. They're going to have to justify.
Oh, cool.
They're going to have to completely tell us their story. So we aren't going to put any kind of requirements in the code.
That'll help us customize the use and the neighborhood, and you won't be stuck with this list that you have to follow. You can look at each situation individually. Got it.
Tom Worth, does that, do you see any issues with that causing it, like, I don't know, like subjectivity, and we let this one go, but we didn't let this one go just based on where it is?
Yeah, I mean, put more onus on people that live in the neighborhood to get in and offer input if they think they'll be adversely impacted. Yeah, I mean, it'll be harder. You might be more often saying like, okay, we gave this one that had this occupancy a break a few months ago. How is this different? Or when you don't have standards, you'd be more often doing that, I think. But it would also give you an opportunity if someone comes up with a unique idea that isn't in the code for accommodating for offloading. Like what if someone said, I'm hiring a bus operator to like take people, from a mile away that where there's plentiful parking or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a nice benefit of it, that there might be some unique ways that people haven't thought about of solving our transportation, especially for nighttime social uses.
When you have to remember too that the current code is a little arbitrary, that we create a number, we pulled this number out of the air and said, based on this square footage of the total restaurant, this is how many parking spaces are needed. And that's regardless of, how many seats you have, how big the kitchen is. So our current, the situation we're using now in the current code is a little bit arbitrary. This helps us, kind of realize the actual market and what the real market demand is, and also what the neighborhood, can support. If it's a really walkable neighborhood, if there's tons of on-street parking, it lets you look at it a lot more individual basis.
Because the building code occupancy standards are more reality based than, I don't even know how they're figured, but
they'll look at seats if you're seated versus standing.
Yeah,
it's an equation. It's a square footage percentage based on sit down tables or open area.
So it is more reality based than the square footage way we've been using. Yeah,
it's square footage plus how the space is going to be used.
Yeah.
Is there a stage, right? I mean, I
correct. Yeah. So if it's an open area, there's a certain square foot per person. You do the square footage, and then you get the number. Or if it's like sit down seating, so it's a math equation.
If we're relying so intensely then on the narrative of the operator saying and convincing us, what if you've got a really great salesperson that's like, yeah, this is how it's going to work, trust me, and we're like, sounds right. What's the back end to that they just they really did jack up the parking in the neighborhood or whatever it was? Is this like, is it, we do special permits currently, so like 12, we issue it for 12 months, then we come back and we hear feedback from the community to say, yeah, it's working, or no, it's not. Is it a similar thing, or are you proposing that we don't have that same type of limitation, or is that up to us?
So I think that's a good question.
It's a really good question that I think we need to discuss. I mean, this feedback is really important because of something like that.
So
I feel like sorry, go ahead, Doreen.
Well, I was just thinking that for only those properties that are going to the planning commission, could they issue a temporary special permit? But if it's not going to planning commission, then what is the vehicle for getting that feedback loop and how it's working and how to do something temporarily and how to strip the permit if it's not doing what it said. So that's something that we're going to talk about, because we got to figure that out.
This is coming from somebody who hates parking, by the way. Like,
Yeah.
Get rid of all of it.
No, I hear you.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, in my humble opinion, I feel that and I know we talked about this before, and I always have said that if we want to behave like a big city, then we have to start making decisions to allow us to become a big city or bigger, although we are big. And one of them is the parking. I always say that if any place that is worth going or interesting to go to, they lack parking. It's just part. It comes with the package. If we want density, then that's what's going to be one of the things that we may have to compromise is parking. And it's very hard to have both of them together. If we look at the picture, that's Rochester right there on Kevin, right? You see this, if we want density, we want less of those, we really want to bring the city in one central location and grow from there. So I'm a little bit on the other side when it comes to parking. I really don't mind not having enough parking in the city.
Yeah, so as you consider that issue, I think that this number that we've presented here as a recommendation is a really key number, that 75 threshold. So I mean, I guess you can kind of consider that like a release valve. And where do you want that number to land? Because if you lean more towards what each of you have been saying about parking, then maybe that number needs to be higher. If you lean more towards a lot of concern about the impacts on the neighborhoods, then maybe that number should be lower. So that number is pretty key, and there's some wiggle room there. Keep in mind though too, just for this group, and whenever we talk about this, when we say that when a business that comes under that threshold, that doesn't mean they don't provide parking. Right. It doesn't mean that we're going to say you can't provide parking. It just says we're not going to dictate it what the level is going to be. So that's a really important distinction.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the other things to remember here, so on the bottom of the slide that asks the question about thresholds, aside from commercial, were some residential considerations. So the conversion of homes, and we see this a lot at the Zoning Board of Appeals, where property owners have, legally converted, but they have expanded their parking. So with the increase of units will undoubtedly oftentimes bring more vehicles, and people want off-street parking. So where that parking goes becomes problematic in terms of, front yard, side yard, rear yard. So that's the point of, calling out those two conversion factors within the residential realm.
Yeah, also, Matt, to build on that a little bit, when we were out with the community and we started talking about upping the units allowed in what's now R2 to this medium density and going to 4 units, people were a little nervous about the conversions that might happen in some of our neighborhoods. And so we kind of promised people at that time that when the conversions happened, that there would be an assessment of some of the impacts of that. And as we all know, just like you're saying, that parking tends to be the thing that people are most concerned about with these conversions. And so we added them to this list basically to respond to the public sentiment we heard during the comprehensive plan process. And because of what Matt said. So there's a couple of reasons why we put those thresholds in there. They do seem like when you compare that against like 75 people in occupancy, it seems like such a small amount, but again, that's responding to community feedback that we got during the comprehensive plan process. So that's what we're trying to be responsive to.
Last follow-on question on parking. This threshold, does it also now apply, or is the intention for it to apply to districts that don't currently require parking, a la CCD?
Good question.
And overlay boutique too, right?
The village center districts as well don't require it.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we haven't drilled down into it that deeply.
We'll write that down though, because that's
yeah. Let's talk about that, because do we need to impose parking requirements where there aren't currently parking requirements?
Right, regardless of.
Do you guys have any feel for that? Any ideas? Don't do it?
I think, yeah, I mean, we've had no parking in CCD for decades. And for the most part, I think it's been very successful and it's helped, bring investment, bring development. So.
And the newer districts, like the village center districts, to Tom's point, also have not required off-street parking.
Matt, you're kind of fading away.
Sorry, I said to Tom's point, the other districts, some of which are newer, the village center districts also do not require parking regardless of size of the use.
Do you guys have any gut reactions to the 75 number based on some of the context we gave you?
No, I think it's reasonable.
Okay.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And then we didn't want to also lose that maximum parking we have requirement now where you can't go over. So we added in here for all other commercial uses when proposed on-site parking exceeds a maximum parking allowance of 2 per 1,000, they're going to need to do a transportation access plan. So it's not just to meet a minimum, but it's also to justify too much parking or a lot of parking being proposed. So that's going to stay there. And again, to try to incentivize less paving for parking. And we have added a hospice residence because a hospice residence is going to be allowed in residential in districts, and it's a new use that we've created based on some things that are happening out there in the world. And so we've decided that when it's located in LDR, MDR, that would have to do a TAP. And a residential care facility, when it's located in an MDR, we have to do it, and then emergency housing. So that would be, yeah, that's prohibited in LD. So that changed completely. So we don't have to worry about that.
How does hospice differ from residential care facility?
It's a different type of unit. It's dictated by a different law. It's Article 40 of the New York State Public Hygiene Law versus Article 41 or something like that. It's a different type of use. So that's a good question, but that's how it differs. And I also think we have, we'll have to look at that. The residential care facility and the residential care dwelling are two different things now. And those are just a scale differential of how many people they're serving. So it's a scale thing, which determines where it can go in those districts. So we're working on that.
Is TAP like administrative approval? What's you mentioned TAP?
Yeah, I think it would be required for uses that require a special permit. And if it's a permitted use, then it would be administrative. I'm thinking, we haven't really decided that, but Mike, I don't know, Matt, do you remember if we've really talked about that?
We did discuss it. I don't know if we landed on anything.
Okay.
No, I'm even more of an ignorant. I'm wondering what TAP actually means.
Oh, that's a transportation access plan. It's basically a combination of the parking demand analysis and the alternative parking plan. It's kind of the same. It's all combined into one document.
Yeah.
And that's been confusing people for a long time, the difference between a parking demand analysis and an alternative parking plan. So, okay, so moving on. Anything else about parking and the thresholds we've established? Okay. All right, so this is also this next one about restaurant drive-throughs versus non-restaurant drive-throughs. We were talking about whether Rochester wants to be a real city or not. And with respect to, deferring to alternate modes of transportation and putting less emphasis, not saying no emphasis, but a little less emphasis on the vehicle. So therefore, how much deference do we want to give to drive-throughs? And we thought, why don't we break out different drive-throughs. So the drive-throughs that are associated with a bank branch or a drugstore, they have a much more accessory kind of feel to them. They're usually a little bit less intensive use compared to a restaurant drive-through, which has a menu board. It usually has, a lot more intensity of use. So why don't we separate them out and regulate them differently and allow them in different locations so we can allow those accessory drive-throughs in a little bit more, more often than a restaurant drive-through. Go ahead, Matt.
And the restaurant drive-throughs, I just wanted to build on what Doreen said. The restaurant drive-throughs can oftentimes be restaurants that operate very early in the morning or very late at night or into the morning. So the associated speakers and menu boards and lighting and things like that could be problematic, whereas banks and pharmacies tend to have more traditional hours, which might mitigate potential impacts to surrounding residential properties if the queuing lane.
And an additional thing is that those two examples are really essential services. So if a bank or a pharmacy wants to move into a neighborhood that doesn't have access to those things, we don't want to get in the way of that from a zoning standpoint. So we're thinking of those as, much different than a drive-through restaurant.
Does anybody have any comments or questions about that idea of separating those out? Then there's also the drive-through kiosk, which is a drive-through that's all by itself, just a drive-through. So that was another drive-through component that we want to regulate all three of those things a little differently.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense to separate them out.
Does anybody?
Different uses.
So we've talked about having drive-through restaurants really restricted in the city. And I don't know, how do you guys feel about potentially really limiting where those can go?
Kim also had a general comment about drive-throughs too.
Okay.
What a girl. I haven't put enough thought into on how much they should be restricted, but I guess, and this isn't really a hill that I would die on, but I don't know I don't know that I am wholeheartedly in agreement that that the drive-through should be treated differently. I can appreciate Tom's comment that we certainly don't want to discourage these essential services in neighborhoods that don't have them, but I guess I'm just not convinced that a drive-through is make or break. But I'd be interested in maybe a bank or a pharmacy's kind of comment on that. I think it's true that there's the potential for less. It's not every bank is a Chick-fil-A here, but bank drive-through at 5:30 on a Friday is very heavily utilized, and there are certain times, lunch hours, really prime times, that I think that they are high uses, and I guess I would maybe like to explore it a little bit more before I wholeheartedly sanctioned one side or the other, because at least in my limited experience, they're just not that different, except for the menu boards and the speakers, which I will give you.
Yeah. Well, okay, then what I would suggest is kind of take a look at that maybe over the next couple months and kind of pay attention maybe to that idea, and we can talk about it in the future again once we've thought about it a little bit.
Yeah, or kind of see maybe how it would play out or how much more relaxed we might get.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
If you made a compelling argument, I'd probably get right on board, but.
No, I think that, I think you've said what it is. And if you're just, like I said, just now, like pay closer attention to that out there and see, look at the bank branches, look at, the drugstores, look at the menu boards and so forth, and just see if you're feeling like one has enough significant more impact than the other and should be restricted more than the other. So I would suggest that we just pay attention to it and let's revisit this later.
Yeah, I think a couple of us have been traumatized by having to slam on our brakes on East Avenue at an unnamed drive-through that blocks East Avenue. So it would be interesting to get some information on non-drive-through restaurants that may have caused similar problems, or where there's also queuing problems. So I mean, they're really the two impacts: the queuing issue, and that's what you're talking about, that the banks may be just as bad, but then the order board and the noise from the menu board is the other issue that typically a bank or a pharmacy drive-through wouldn't have.
I think it also has to do with a little bit more, a lot too, with the amount of land that has to be dedicated to that particular operation because of the menu board and the, double drive-throughs or the triple drive-throughs or whatever, and trying to accommodate that vehicle queuing and use of that site, and how it might interrupt a pedestrian flow or pedestrian use of the sidewalks or the getting to the property, or other types of multimodal access. So it's just something I think you need to notice and pay attention to and see if you agree. You may not, and we may combine them again. So I'm open to it.
I'll just mention too that in making that distinction, we looked beyond just land use and design implications of the two different categories, but we also looked at just sort of day-to-day quality of life implications for people who live in the city, and the necessity of having access to a pharmacy, and the necessity of having access to banking, even if it sometimes is in the form of drive-through, which isn't ideal, but is a necessity in a lot of cases. Whereas, and far be it from me to besmirch the donut, but the necessity of fast food restaurants and places like that is a little bit of a different thing to consider in the big picture, beyond just land use and design.
And we're not suggesting that the restaurants, we don't want the restaurant. It's just suggesting that, maybe the emphasis should be on walk up and not necessarily on the drive-through. But some of these business models rely on the drive-through, and so you really are closing them out if you don't allow drive-through. So there's again, this is a balancing situation. We've got to figure out what the right balance is to get the urban character we're looking for, but not, shut down access to all these businesses. So, okay, so we've really only got two more issues, and the next one is about urban ag. And we've broken up into community garden and urban farm. And we have
you wanted to take kind of a temperature check on being more or less restrictive of drive-throughs on the whole. Was that responded to?
And breaking them up into two different categories.
Oh, okay.
Those are the two things. So thank you, Anna, for clarifying that. So with respect to urban ag, we're talking about two different types of community. Right now, we don't have it in the code, in the existing code. So this is a new thing. We've broken it up into community garden and urban farm, and the distinction is really about scale. So what we're going to ask you here is, one of the questions we had is, should we put a limit on the size, the maximum size of an urban farm? And, the question is, obviously there's interest in this as a wealth building opportunity, also providing opportunities for access to fresh food. There's a lot of great things about urban farming. Is there a reason to limit the size? And if you guys think there is, I'd be curious to see if you have any thoughts on what the size should be, if there should be limits or whatever.
Well, I guess for me, a concern would be most residential size lots that are available in the city are relatively small. You figure they're probably 45 by probably no more than 120, 150 feet in size. To me, that makes a lot of sense to allow that. But to have multiples, if you have them side by side or every other lot in some neighborhoods that I'm sure it may exist, then you may look at a whole different issue of, is that a farm or is that, for specialty use?
Yeah. what would you think if, you know, say there's, you know, that lot you're talking about is about a quarter of an acre, right? I believe, isn't it? Or
Yeah,
is
I'm
it-
not sure what size a
or
normal
is it
city
10th of
lot
an
is.
acre? Is that a 10th of an acre? I guess it is.
Yeah, typical, I mean, standard is about 40 by 100.
100, right.
You got about 4,000 square feet.
Yeah. So thinking about that, like in terms of acreage, so yeah, so if you get about 4, okay, now you guys are going to test my math here. But if it's a 10th, then you get 4 of them and it's a quarter of an acre. So, you know, thinking about in terms of that, you know, how big would you want to see an urban farm get? Is there something, you know, we limit scale on so many other things in the code. Is this something we're going to limit the scale on? I mean, a community garden is naturally going to be small. It's just by the definition. But an urban farm is taking on a little bit more of a intense use, and it could be animals. We're talking, you know, crops or whatever, you know, agriculture. So we're just trying to get an idea if there should be a limit in the size, and at what point does it become too big?
You know, well, I guess for me, I think if you're looking at continuous units or continuous lots would be the determiner for me. If you have, you know, more than 4 continual lots or up to 4 contiguous lots, that's going to be pretty massive in a residential area. So you may want to limit it, you know, something like that. But they have to be contiguous lots before I think that number kicks in or would kick in.
So Dave, I think I think you still have to put it into numbers only because I see what happens if there's a re-subdivision at some point and 4 lots are now 1, and then you've got 3 more adjacent to that.
Yeah,
And then if
understand.
7. So perhaps like finding an average lot size and then multiplying that out, and that's the actual acreage that you're talking about as a limit.
Yeah.
That might be a good fit. I have a question too about like assessment. Just curious. I don't know how like now defining it, because they exist. There are places, there's special permitted places. I know we saw one on this board like a year or so ago up near the public market. What's the tax assessor's office going to say? Like how does that get looked at now that it's like called out?
I have no idea. That's a good question. Does anybody else know that?
No, I don't know it's a good question. So, you know, not for urban agriculture, but they have their own classifications of things. So if someone changes use or establishes use on a property that wasn't like that before, the building permit ends up with the assessment bureau, and then they equate it to whatever they have. What that is, I don't know. But yeah, they would absolutely have to be involved. That's a great question.
Really good question. We will check in with the city assessor and talk about that.
Go ahead, Anna.
There was at least one example of utilizing the roof of a public parking garage, or maybe it was privately owned public parking garage on Monroe and Alexander, where the rooftop was comprised of raised garden beds. If there were to be a limit on size, would that kind of take away from utilizing underutilized parking garages for urban agriculture?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I have more questions than answers on topic. Because I also feel like is it individual? Can I, if I'm on a home and I have an empty lot next door, then we find ourselves in a paradox where then we want density, but then he may want to buy that empty lot to do a garden, and so. Where do we draw the line of how many permits can we get? Is it everywhere in the city? How far apart from they have to be?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because we generally talk about things in terms of primary or principal use and accessory use. So if someone is, you know, if someone buys a vacant property next door to them and they expand their property to include a garden, and it's their own private garden, it's not a community garden, so it's they're operating their own garden, that would just be part of that residential property, right? Matt, am I saying that right? It would just be the garden of the person who owns that property.
Right.
Same part, yeah.
But then at what point does it become an urban farm?
Right, where the intensity is different.
Yeah,
Right.
where it's starting to become a commercial, basically a kind of a commercial operation versus a residential operation.
Right.
That's kind of the question we're trying to get at. Like, what is the size? What is the scale when it becomes a commercial, or I guess they would probably object to the word commercial, but a more not a non-residential use.
Not really accessory anymore to the person living.
And keeping in mind that, what we're also talking about is not only the growing of crops, but we would also be permitting the selling of that produce as part of the use. So that's another factor to consider, is when you're talking about how big they should be.
Right. Would you go to the same topic that if how about if they sell and it's going really well in that specific neighborhood, so they want to expand, how big could they expand within the same neighborhood? Now, instead of building a house next door, maybe he even want to buy the house to demo it and extend his business.
So you absolutely you've gathered what our question is about. Commissioner Harding, you had
Yeah, I've got one more consideration, and I don't know if this is in our realm, but what about limitations on, like, from an environmental perspective? Do we have rules regarding what can be used? At the risk of outing myself here, like, I grew up in a really small town across the street from the cornfields. Like, our school, we had to close all the windows in the summer because it smelled terribly during fertilizer season. I'm thinking, if that's my house and I've got an urban farm sitting next door, like, is there any regulation on what can be spread?
no, I think that's an excellent point.
But I don't know if that goes into zoning code or the environmental code or something, or if that's even within our realm. But if I'm a homeowner and we let an urban farm come in next door, I mean, that's a huge consideration. And I'm sure that there's probably also other, like, eco things that we'd want to consider before we start mass growing crops in the city limits.
Should we have two types of gardens? One is a community garden, and one is an urban farm. And I think by doing so, you differentiate one from the other one. By size. I mean, you of course it's dense, density that will make the difference. So that will allow people, right? We have a project and we are having a community farm, which is probably 16 raised bed, so that the community can work on that. That's not a farm, but people are able to have some vegetables and those things. So so if you differentiate, and you might be able to deal with the size, with the density that way.
Yep. So that's actually what we are doing with the community garden. Is one use, and then an urban farm is another use.
Okay.
And that we're trying to distinguish, like, what we're trying to figure out, what is the size for an urban farm? What is the what are some of the limits on the urban farm? Should an urban farm get as big as it needs to get to prosper? Should it be limited in size, in scale, or limited and I think that the commissioner made a really good point about some of the practices, whether it's fertilizing or pesticide use or something, environmental issues related to that, and how can zoning play a role in that? And that's something we'd have to look into, because we haven't really talked about that too much.
It's a good question, though, because there's obvious benefits to the person doing it as the applicant, but there's also potential detriments that either need to be addressed somehow.
You keep fading out, Matt.
Based on that, I'm sorry, my microphone, I think, is. I was just saying, no, it's a good point, because there's obviously benefits, to the applicant, but there are also potential detriments or things that either need to be mitigated or addressed in some fashion, and whether that's in the zoning code or somewhere, it needs to be discussed.
Does anybody have just a gut reaction to what maybe a size limitation would be for an urban farm? If you were going to suggest a size, I don't even, do people, first of all, do people think a size limitation is appropriate? And if so, does anyone have a gut feeling of what that size limit might be?
I think that if you have the right location, like there was an urban farm somewhere behind School 45 because it was a landlocked space, and it was a real farm, but it wasn't intrusive in any manner, and so they raised stuff there, but the size was it was a big size, and so people use. I wouldn't object to that.
What size do you have any idea what the size of that was?
No, it might still exist.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for you, Doreen, but a quick Google search for urban farming pulls up a whole boatload of articles about how to be most profitable doing so, and some of them are relating to size.
Okay.
And so that might be a good place, at least to start putting some ideas together in sizing. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
And Cornell, I mean, if you reach out to Cornell Co-op, they might have really strong, we were talking to them at Sibley, and they had some strong opinions on urban agricultural too at one point.
Could some of it also just, I don't know, be driven by the economics itself? Like, we wouldn't want a huge space downtown, but like, who's gonna raise a building to put in an urban farm? So the further where you get out, where the space might make more sense, we probably care less about how big it is. And I wonder if that's a problem that we maybe don't need to be as concerned about solving.
And that goes back to my point, Kim, about the tax assessor's office, because like if it's not the best use of land and the taxes, like if the rate's going to be higher in the city than it would be out like way off into the rural space. If a farmer wants land, they're gonna go from a marketing, yeah, you follow that.
Yeah, I mean, we might be talking about a problem that doesn't really exist because the market takes care of it.
Yep, agreed. Okay. Anything else with that?
No, I'm just thinking, I'm like laughing now, thinking about like, would you rather have an urban farm next door or a hostel? Like,
yeah, or a boarding house. Yeah. Yeah, Iris, do you know if you worked in a city, I know you worked in Buffalo and other cities similar to ours, do they have size limitations at all in urban farming?
Typically, they don't put limitations on its maximum overall size. There's usually a minimum to get started to even be considered an urban farm. That minimum needs to be in place because kind of as I think Commissioner Herding pointed out, there's a lot of impacts when you go from a community garden to a farm. Farms are almost industrial operations. They are smelly, they are dusty. There's a lot of impacts that come from them. If you have livestock, that's a whole other thing. So typically what you would need as you bring in the urban farm is some minimum square footage or acreage really to start the farm. But we haven't seen it capped because the market tends to control that. It's really, it's not like, you're going to get your highest and best out of building houses there and having people move into those houses. So I don't see anything wrong with putting a cap on it, but it's not something we've really seen yet to date. It's really more dealing with standards for, if you have livestock, you got to be 500 feet from residential or whatever that is, because to get those separations going and make sure it operates that way. Because the community garden is, they squeeze into neighborhoods. They're small. There's not a lot of impacts. It's just some plants and some gardening that goes on. Mm-hmm. Farming is a different beast altogether.
Okay.
I ratify what Kim said about smells. From having growing up in Brighton near 12 Corners when Gunzenhauser Dairy Farm was going full blast. I mean, we were probably 2/3 of a mile away, you know, and yeah, certain summer nights when the wind was going the right way. Woof.
Yeah, yeah, I can attest to it myself.
Uh,
Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about today is also potentially controversial issue. And what we were thinking, and we're designing it right now internally, is this idea of allowing some height bonuses or commercial area, square footage bonuses if we get higher standard of materials and design, um, and maybe some sustainable amenities, whether it's a green roof or solar or some other things. But so right now, the current code says for commercial square footage in the C1 is 3,000 square feet, and the square footage for C2, the maximum square footage for C2 is 6,000 square feet. The proposed code, based on what we talked about in the comprehensive plan, which is adopted, is in the proposed code is the BMU, which is the comparable district to a C1. The boutique mixed use is remaining at 3,000 square feet. And the NMU is going up to 9,000 square feet, and that's per use. And building height, there are no maximum building height regulations in the current code, but in accordance with the comprehensive plan, we were talking about for the BMU going to 40 feet and an NMU 50 feet. So what if there was a provision in the code that said you could get a little more square footage without going for an area variance, or you could get a little more height, assuming, of course, that we have standards in there for mitigating impacts to adjacent properties. But if you wanted to go a little higher or a little bigger without an area variance, but you have to present us with some really top quality design and materials, what do you guys think about that idea?
Amazing.
Yeah, I like the idea of it. I think it needs to be really, really thought out in terms of like, it's going to be fun because you could think through it a lot, and then a developer could look at it and be like, yeah, I'm not going to get the dollars for it. So I'm just like careful about how much work you put into creating those standards without feedback and directly like understanding whether it's viable in the actual market. I see that. Also, is there any sort of like, so this is just building height, no translation into how many stories in said building then, right?
High end stories, I'm assuming is, I'm assuming we will hire to allow more story.
Yeah, we've just really been thinking about it conceptually, but probably we were thinking with height, it would be just one more story, basically.
Got it. Do you think it might be useful to spell that out? Actually say like some people might think differently about height and stories, and if that was the intention, it might be useful to call it stories.
So Arista, what do you think about that? Because that was something you recommended too, was that we go with feet rather than stories. You want to explain that a little bit?
Right. We always have recommended just simplifying height measurement from being used in, you'll typically see it feet and stories. Or sometimes just stories. Now, the idea is that the stories is kind of unpredictable because you don't know what those stories can be. You don't know if they're going to be short residential, they're going to be tall loft buildings. With COVID, while we're all on Zoom, we don't know what those ventilation systems between are going to be. So story height can vary a lot. And so we've always said it's very clear to say, we're just going to do it in height. We don't have to worry what's a basement, what's a cellar, what's an attic. All of that stuff is gone. It's just how tall is this building? That means all the buildings next to it can be that tall. So we have done bonus systems in place for things like that, where we move just to the feet measurement. And the idea is if you wanted to do what we've typically done and said, if really what we're talking about theoretically is a bonus height of 1 story, you typically use 15 feet because that gives you enough flexibility between kind of what that story could be. We can talk about it colloquially in stories, people understand that, but I think for purposes of code and make the code easier to use, just use feet.
Cool. Would you do a rubric where it's like, hit these 3 things, you get 15 more feet or 10 more feet, do this and you get 20? Or is it only a cap of 1, like 1 extra story or 10 feet or whatever?
We have not talked about that.
Yeah.
I would really, it would be, if you guys have any gut reactions to that or any experience with it or advice about that, we'd love to hear it.
No, I agree with what you were saying. And I think the building code also, once it comes to height, then the building code would probably have those restrictions that we're looking for. So I think the word height is a little more lenient for the design than instead of just having the stories. And in addition to that, I think the AIA is really pushing sustainability all across in their own design. So I think as design professionals are really adopting this new idea of sustainability, I think we should go with this. So I'm all for it and really explore. So maybe even reading the AIA when it comes to sustainability, that might be a good thing for you guys. And also you'll probably talk about new products that are being implemented into designs that maybe if we have some of those products as a right instead of as a special permit, maybe that will also help a little bit with the design intent as this design professional start to have a building, then they don't have to start thinking that they need a special permit to maybe incorporate solar panels or things like that. So maybe some of those new technology, if we have it, if the design professional has it as a right, I think that probably be beneficial.
Yeah, if they have a clear path forward, they might be willing to, spend the money to do, to acquire the property, to design a great building. If they knew that they're going to give us these extra things, and then in return, they know that they have an as of right project.
Right.
This rubric idea, I is like familiar, and so quick Google search, LEED does it. Not that you have to plagiarize LEED or partner with LEED in particular, because I'm sure there are multiple, but they've got 4 levels: certified, silver, gold, and platinum, all points based. And that could be a similar thing could be set up like, here's your cap that you can get top level.
So Arista, is this something you guys have some experience with that you can help us with this?
Yeah, we have done bonus systems in a variety of ways. In particular, whatever the kind of key priorities of the city are, building those into a kind of bonus structure. If you want to do it on a point system, if you want to do it just if you do these actions, then you can go higher. There's so many different ways that this can be crafted.
Okay.
That we should have a conversation on it. We've done a number of these. We just did one in Saratoga Springs, 15-foot height bonus in the downtown related to affordable housing, sustainability, a couple other different things that were key city priorities. So we've done one in New York State itself.
So overall then, before we embark on this with Camiros, there's obviously support for us going in this direction then?
I wouldn't in the area of environmental sustainability, because it's pretty far outside our expertise and outside the land use realm. And there's other ways that we can incentivize it. There's other means, governmental means by tax credits or other things to incentivize it.
Okay.
But I would be a big fan of like affordable housing, because that's something that bears in land use
yeah, no, we already talked about that. Affordable housing we have leverage for that in other ways from the city.
Yeah. Okay, so then I feel the same way about environmental sustainability.
All right, well, we'll talk to Arista about that and see if we can find something that we can all feel comfortable with. But as long as we know the Planning Commission feels like it's something worth pursuing, we'll spend a little more time on it. Okay. That's the end. Are there anything we didn't talk about that you guys has occurred to you or you've been thinking about that relate to zoning, rewriting the zoning code?
Yeah, just Just quickly, I had some questions about tiny houses
Okay,
and impact on lot size, setbacks. Again, an example, you may have an empty lot in the city. Someone wants to put in a tiny house. Do they have to put in one and have the whole lot the rest of the lot be open? Or could they put two on a lot? Those
Yep.
kinds of issues, those kinds of concerns.
so let's talk about that a little bit. So what we've been working on is reducing the minimum lot size and potentially, like we kind of talked to ourselves, like, why do we care about minimum lot size? Why do we care about lot size? Well, we really care about sort of the contextual, maybe the frontage and how it just interfaces with the street. And so, what are we really thinking about? And we've talked about, eliminating the minimum lot size or reducing it. So we do want to talk about these alternative housing types that would be, a tiny house. So it needs a smaller lot. And how do we do that without making them go through a variance and everything else? So yes, we are considering that. And yeah. So anything else the team wants to add to that? I kind of jumbled that up a little bit, but.
No, it's a good conversation, and people ask it all the time, and our current response is, of course, well, first, tiny is relative to the person asking, of course, right? Define tiny, but no, typically, if you're building a single-family dwelling in a use that permits a single-family dwelling, the current code is contextual based, kind of like what Doreen is talking about. So you can do it. It's if you meet a series of criteria. If not, you could get a variance. As it relates to the new code, though, yeah, it's going to be, I think, contextual based too. But without a draft code, we wouldn't have an answer. But definitely, it's on the list to discuss.
Yeah, one of the things, we have this terminology that's used in City Hall. It's called the unbuildable lot. And Matt and I have been kind of fighting against that unbuildable lot for a few years now, right, Matt? That, it just because it's 30 feet wide doesn't make it unbuildable, or 35 feet wide. So we think a lot of lots are buildable that are now considered unbuildable, and we need to address that. So we're working on that.
And we also, as far as the tiny houses are concerned, there's currently residential design standards that might work pretty strongly against the establishment of a tiny house. And we've talked about sort of loosening those residential design standards to allow more flexibility out there. But in any case, I just wanted to ask you, Commissioner Watson, is there a direction that you think that we should kind of lean when it comes to that issue of tiny houses, about being more inclusive to allow them, or do you have concerns about allowing them? What's your take on that?
Well, I guess my take is that I would be open to see them more available in all parts of the city. I think there's potential with the number of lots that are available, that are vacant. These might be viable options for some people or some families to be able to say, I can build a smaller house on a city lot and still have everything that I would have if I built a 1,400, 1,600 square foot home. And so to provide additional options to have those properties back on the tax roll in ways that would be viable and still fit in with the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's also, you talk about tiny homes, people have these visions of these little, 300 square feet or 400 square feet, but maybe smaller, I don't remember. But there's also small, you can take it above a tiny home, classic tiny home, and take it into a small home realm. You're right. You can start creating some really nice affordable single family homes, or, affordable units that I think would be nice for a neighborhood, so we have to figure that out.
What about the number of tiny homes you could put on a lot? It would seem to make more sense to me to have a restriction on that than maybe the size of the home, so you don't end up with a neighbor that's it could quickly turn into some type of, I don't know how quickly, our lots aren't that huge, so it's not like you're gonna put 25 tiny homes on there, but
Well, they're
really, really tiny.
They there have been proposals in the city for like a tiny home village.
Yeah, or something.
So-
I'm thinking that like you end up with the tiny home, maybe analogy of a trailer park that you might not be prepared for as a neighbor, or even a lot of tenants kind of access tiny home.
So yeah, you would still have to limit the number of units on the property. Yeah, for sure. So that would be part of the discussion. Just because you have more room doesn't mean you can fill it up.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, to Kevin's point, like how much are we really running up against the state fire and building codes? Like, are they more of a barrier to small homes? I don't know. Are those codes more a barrier to small homes or tiny homes than our
Only
zoning
the
code is?
tiniest.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you were gonna make a really, really, really tiny home, that's tough, but
But otherwise,
maybe
it's
400 square feet, depends on the size of the bedroom and the size of the loft. Sometimes the lofts above the first floor are too small.
so then you just have what, like 10 feet separations from windows on the other house, or is that more for multi-family?
No,
I'm
they would have
referring to the
same-
only building code thing rule I know in the whole world.
I think the setback requirements would be the same. I'm saying that there's building code requirements for the size of the rooms and the height of the room. So you can't have you probably couldn't have a 250 square foot home, depending,
Okay. Well, we'll pay attention to that when we start looking at the that, the minimum size or whatever. We'll look at the building code. Anything else? All right. Well, you guys stuck it out with us tonight. Appreciate that.
Just wanted to remind everyone, the website rochesterzap.com. You can find, as we chatted about earlier, lots of good information on there, as well as the information on the informational meeting June 28th at 6 p.m. To submit comments or sign up this week.
Going out on us.
What's that?
We didn't catch any of
out
that.
on us.
And like all the important parts.
So he was saying is on June 28th is the meeting where it's an informational meeting and people from the community are going to be able to speak up. And at that meeting, you'll be just basically taking comments from the public that'll help feed into this. And probably many of them are listening today or will be watching this between now and then, and we'll be generating interest and comments, and they are going to speak to you on the 28th. It's not a time where we're getting into a lot of debate or dialogue. It's really just to hear from the community about some of the stuff that we've been talking about over the last couple months. So that happens on June 28th. So be ready for that. And again, we'll be getting code and map out to hopefully the community this fall. That's our hope. It depends. A lot of things, can get in the way of that, but that's our hope. And rochesterzap.com is the other thing Matt said. So
Yeah, sorry about my audio issues. Thank you, everyone.